do you make a decision about your life's work? Join me today as I talk to Bright Sheng, composer, director.
Uncommon Sense with Junia Doan, sharing the wisdom and insight of those who have been there and done that.
Hello everybody, welcome back to Uncommon Sense, and a special warm welcome to those of you tuning in for the first time. This is a program about real life, real people. This is a program of guests who share their life experience and their wisdom with us. This is the second part of a two-part interview with Bright Sheng. In the first section, we talked about his life, his growing up in China, his serendipitous interest in music. This segment is about his life as a composer and as a conductor. In the prior interview, he talked about his attraction to folk music in the province in which he went to school following junior high. And that has played out in much of your music, the folk melodies. What tempted you or drew you to blend Western music and Chinese music?
That's a good question, because I always thought myself as a Western musician, because I studied piano. I even picked up studying English during the time I was in Shanghai, and folk music. But folk music was also the part of my education, the music that I grew up with. I think life experience is very important for any creative artists, especially for composers. The music you grew up with, you can't just ignore. If you ignore it, it's something artificial, superficial about this. And it was difficult because Western music, especially at the time that when I first moved to New York and to study Western music and contemporary Western music, and it was the folk music which is a part of my upbringing, and the Western music which is also part. To blend the two, I didn't know how. And it took me a while. It feels like the language. When I first started, when I first moved to New York, every time I watched TV, I tried to understand a sentence in English, and I had to translate in my head into Chinese to understand. Or if I tried to speak in English, and I had to form a sentence in my head in Chinese, then translate. I don't do that anymore. So I think it's a growing situation, and then you start to blend these two and become part of you. So now I feel comfortable both with Western culture and Asian culture. Of course, now my interest is not only limited to folk music in China, but also classical music in China, but also music outside China as well, Asian, and I'm very fascinated about the Silk Road culture.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and all that.
That had a different thematic musically?
Well, the whole music character is very different. The Central Asian music. In the year 2000, I took 2 months trip beyond the Silk Road and collected music. So, but I think it's a growing situation. But on the other hand, there's also a lifetime sort of commitment you want to study for both cultures. I think the fusion, so to speak, is a sort of trendy thing now. But one must realize a profound fusion has to come from the bottom rather than from the top. In other words, the deeper understanding you have for both cultures, the better result
you can pull from.
Yeah, and
more.
It's sort of like a filter through me, and whatever comes out. But the deeper understanding you have for both culture, the more profound, I think, the fusion could happen. So it's more like, ideally, should be metamorphosis rather than hybrid.
Interesting. You study with Leonard Bernstein.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Did his style of composing become part of the repertoire from which you pull?
Well, I study a lot of his music, but I think the most important thing besides, the regular thing that you learn from a teacher, I showed him my composition, he taught me about conducting and various other things in general in music, but I think the most profound thing he taught me was that one has to be oneself. Don't let other people, because it was, to influence you too much, and you should learn from others, but you have to come up with your own synthesis. I think that was a very important lesson, because he himself was an example. At the time when everybody was writing, so, as a composer, everybody was writing avant-garde music. He stuck to his guns, and he stayed to whatever he believed. And then now his music is being played a lot more than the other music that around at the time. I think it could be quite overwhelming, because all my teachers at the school, at the time, was very academic kind of approach to studying composition. So everybody says you should do this, and I felt bewildered and lost somehow. And he was the one that sort of managed to point to the right direction and sort of pulled me out from this.
Do you think there's a different style of teaching composition in America and, say, Europe?
Yeah, very much so. Part of the reason was because the funding situation. In this country, arts, as you know, funding are mostly private fundings. And the government has very, very little funding. And but in Europe, most funding came from, at least at the time, from the government. So they didn't have to worry about the audience issue, how the money come. So this country, a composer's career is made by performers or administrators in major symphony orchestras, opera companies. They believed in you, and they want you to write music, and they perform music, they present your music. But they have to worry about their audience. So there is a kind of, maybe not direct, but indirect interaction with the audience. As a composer, in Europe, you don't. You write for each other. And that was very much the case between the university academic situation in the United States at the time, in late 80s. But it has changed a great deal, and I think America is way ahead of Europe now in terms of leading, be free. Because America is a country that, all ideas came and sort of gelled together, and you can't really define when you say American music. What is American music? It's everything. It's all these things, which is wonderful.
So am I understanding you that you're saying composing for different employers, so to speak, and therefore possibly different audiences, creates more of a range of music when you say America's way ahead? Or because it emphasizes the individual's expression, like to say, be true to yourself and who you are musically? Right,
and there's no set of sort of ideals, so that's the way to write music. And it's still a little bit like that in Europe, in most of European countries. But this country, anything, from one side, minimalist music on one side, or to very avant-garde music on the other, anything could coexist, which is wonderful, because we can choose. As a composer, I always believe now we live in a very fortunate time, because we could learn from our teachers' generation and pick up anything we want and write your own music. So our palette has been enlarged, and the spectrum is being enlarged, and but therefore give us more means to express, to be more expressive. And after all, art is and the purpose of art is to touch people, to touch, and to emotionally inspire people. So that is very important.
We live in a world, our folk tunes seem to be pop and rock and rap these days. Is that something that saturates into you as a frame of reference as the folk tunes did?
I think so too. I've been living here, almost as long as I have lived in China. So that's something that American culture, pop culture, it was overwhelming also. But at the beginning, I tried to avoid that because for one way or the other reason, I tried to find my own way on that. But now I think I'm more secure or more confident to take that. Actually, I start to study those and listening to those once in a while and to see if I can enlarge my, again, it's another way of enlarge my spectrum of music spectrum. And one of the projects I'm working on is a Broadway musical.
Oh, I'd like to hear about that.
It's based on a Monkey King story. So going to be I hope it's going to be the first of a martial arts musical.
Give me a hint.
Well, you know the famous story of the Monkey King, the Chinese story, a journey made to the West. It's a draw from that story. It's going to be one episode from that. So we're still just at the beginning part we're working on. I have a wonderful librettist who's a wonderful veteran in the musical. His name is Arnold Weinstein. Mm-hmm. Wrote a lot of musicals, and so I'm really looking forward to get on to that.
Now, when you take us through the creative process of composition, say for this particular work, because it's a Chinese story, would you pull from that aspect? Because it's a martial arts, but in America, Broadway venue, would you think on your American side? Talk about a little bit to me about.
Well, hopefully, hopefully this work would be appreciated by both sides of the both sides of the Pacific. Either American would understand something about Chinese arts, but you can't just offer them a total Chinese experience. They feel exotic, but it's not quite. They got to have some reference. And in the Chinese part too, they learn something about Western musical. So I think it's me. I often say this, that I'm 100% Chinese. I'm also 100% American. So how could that be? You add up to 200, but that's exactly what I am. So hopefully my work will serve as a bridge between the two cultures, but each side has to find some kind of reference and something they're familiar with, and it goes through me and comes out naturally. Should.
There's a famous architect called I.M. Bay, and he went to China to help the country, and he designed a hotel. I think it's called Fragrant Hills. But in any case, he came back to America somewhat frustrated, and he gave this interview, and he said, I always thought I was Chinese, and then I went to China to try and bring this project to fruition, and I found out how American I really am. And I think that's what you're saying. You can live really well in both cultures and see the pluses and minuses. Do you think people of Chinese culture respond to your music differently than people of, say, American or even European back cultures?
It's very interesting. In the year, I think it was 2000, for the first time in Beijing, I had a symphony concert. I conducted the whole concert of my music. And before that, it was very little known in China. My music was played very little. People had learned about me and know my name or knew me before I left China. But they heard that I had kind of a career going in the States, and they didn't know what my music was. So this is for the first time. And I was nervous, and I think the whole audience was sort of not nervous. They were sort of wait and see what you can have. And at the end, I got all standing ovation. They understood the music because the music was touching. Because they had, in China, there's still very much European influence. They believed new music should be abstract and new art. They was because they were just reopened. I mean, in the last 20 years, they started gradually open up to the Western culture. So there were a lot of misconcepts. So you have to go beyond that. You realize art is art, after all, and its purpose is to touch people emotionally, inspire people. So I had 3 pieces on the program, and the first piece. And we played very well. It was a very little applaud. And I went backstage, backstage, I said to the soloist, that interesting, they didn't like this piece. Right. And the second piece got a little warmer. By the end, they were really, very happy with the whole concert. And I didn't quite understand. I thought maybe they just liked the little piece, each piece better. But the next day, I had an interview with a local critic. He told me, he said, the reason they didn't applaud because they didn't know how to react, because they actually were touched by the music, but they didn't know they were supposed to be doing that because the new music was not. So I think ultimately, certainly this is one of my goals, is to have my music played and without border lines and thinking about whether this is Chinese audience or Western audience. It should humanity, and music should touch different people. And the other thing is, also on the other side, I wrote a piece called Hun, which is about the Cultural Revolution. The subtitle is called, Hun is the Chinese word for lacerations. The subtitle is 1966 to 1976, and in memoriam 1966 to 76, which is the 10 years period of the Cultural Revolution. And it was played in New York, premiered in New York. It was an old Jewish lady who sat next to me. And the first half of the concert was some Chopin concerto and piano concerto. And we were chatting along. She didn't know I was the composer of the next piece. And I asked her whether she liked the piece or not. And then after my piece was played, I went up to the stage and took a bow and came back, and she turned around and said to me, she said, if you just change the title to the Holocaust, it will be just appropriate. I felt that was just the highest compliment I could ever have for my music. So I don't think it was about whether it's about the Cultural Revolution, whether it's about something else. It's the artwork. You should, if you can touch one person, as they say, you've done your job.
That's a high compliment.
Yeah.
She gave you. Truly.
Yes.
A very great honor. You wrote a wonderful opera called Madame Mao. Are you drawn to write another opera?
Well, at the moment,
opportunity presented.
Well, at the moment, I think opera is a huge undertaking, because not only because it takes a longer time, but takes a long time to prepare, and it's very expensive to produce, and a lot of things are at stake. So one has to be careful. With me, I think if I can write one opera every 10 years, I'll be very happy. So in the remainder of my life, I have a few coming. But at the moment, I'm thinking of this musical.
I see that. It's bringing a lot of happiness to your face.
Yeah. I think it's sort of a slightly different direction that I'm taking.
Because the pieces are shorter, the melodic themes?
Well, it's a lighter piece. It's supposed to be humorous and lighter and entertaining. So Broadway is more on that side than, say, an opera could be more serious. And Madame Mao is a very serious subject. It's essentially a tragedy. It's very serious, and it's grand opera by its definition. So,
what do you think the future of classical music is versus, I don't want to say Broadway, but say rap and what we find in the popular segment?
Well, classical music, by its definition, is it's part of the fine arts, and because of that, fine arts, just like a fine dining, is only for a small group of people. It could never be as McDonald's everybody would go to. On the other hand, for any art form to stay alive, one has to go forward, look forward, to do something interesting and exciting. You can't rely on just playing the same pieces over again, because people will get bored with that and people will stop coming. Because one generation passed, the next generation will not come unless you do something interesting. And education was part of it, but the others have, I would think 50% should be concentrated of our effort should be concentrated on the education, the young people to learn about what the beauty of the classical music. But also, the other 50% is that we have to develop that art form to bring in new things, exciting things. Because if you look at history, the development of classical music, symphony music, opera, was pushed by the composers, and they always had something new, something great to say. So gradually the form had enlarged, people start to come and continue to come.
Do you think, what is your thought on incremental change in, say, composition versus radical change, and how it might be received by an audience?
Well, I think both could be experimented. You know, one could never know. I mean, I always say this, there are only two kinds of music in the future, good music and bad music. And I think in the future, the borderline between what is classical music, what is pop, what is folk, what is jazz, and all this would be blurred. The lines are blurred, but good music will stay. And I think any art form should be innovative and do innovative things. And it was very interesting. Yesterday, the New York Times had a story about London Symphony, 100 years anniversary of London Symphony. They talked about how in the late 80s that the orchestra almost went bankrupt, and then one person came, saved it. And they, even though they didn't have money, they would still go arts first and the money second. They find the money and they will do it, and they do, and it succeeded. They became one of the most important orchestras in the world, and certainly, you know, arguably the best orchestra in England. So I think if all the management and in arts institutions in this country do the same thing, we certainly have hope.
Isn't that interesting? It shows you what a contribution one could make to the field of art. You can be a composer, you can be a performer, you can be the person who saves a symphony, right, through leadership efforts. Amazing. What do you try and teach your students of composition at the University of Michigan?
Well, composition, like anything else, that, you know, experience, you know, has something to say about it. And I'm more experienced than most of my students as a composer. And there are techniques one can teach, but inspiration, I can only try to inspire them, but I don't think I can teach the inspiration. That's part of their talent. So, but what I try to help them is to guide them to say whatever they want to say, but in the most efficient way, in most economic way, and the most direct way.
So people either have talent for composition or they do not. It cannot be created. The reason I ask that, people talk a lot about you can bring out the creative side of someone, or you can teach them to do something, and I hear a slightly different answer.
There's always, everybody has some creative part, but you know, and you can't compare apples with orange. Each person is individual, so they have their own talent, and they can only compare with themselves. Have they done, you know, did he or she do their best, the very best, and bring out that? But then you put on different people on the same level, and you know, if you do a competition, a judgment, when we do the admissions, we give out grades, and then you have to sort of compare people. In a way, it's unfair, but that's the way, the system that we use. And then certain people probably has other things that are more talented. I mean, some of our students graduated, some of the very high quality students that graduated probably never would become a professional musician, because it's a hard living. It's a hard profession to make a living. If they're smart, they, you know, some of them and went to other professions, and it's a strange calling thing that if you feel that's the thing you must do, then you must do. You're passionate about it, you have to do it. But it's difficult because I went through the same difficulty. And a few years ago, I was given the commencement speech, and I said, everybody say this, and just do what your heart tells you do, and what you love to do, and that you'll be fine. I think that's fine. And certainly that's one approach, one way to look at it. But because I came from another culture, maybe I also have another thought. Maybe one can find out what do you do the best. Mm-hmm. If what you do the best happens to be what you love the most, right, then you are blessed or right, cursed. Right. Right. So because you have no choice, you have to follow that route. But if what you happen to do the best is not what you happen to love the most, then you have a ambivalence and you have to choose. But whatever you choose, you should not ever look back, because that's your calling also.
That is beautiful. We want to thank Bright Sheng for being with us today. He has shared his life in music, and out of that come a few important points. One is you are your life experience, and you can draw fully from it. He talks about being 100% Chinese and 100% American, but even as he lives today, he takes in aspects of our popular culture that become part of his personal expression. He agrees with Leonard Bernstein, who was a professor of his, teacher of his, and that is you can only speak your own or play your own song. You have to be true to who you are musically and really who you are as a person. He talks about the necessity of developing your creative aspects, first identifying them. But as he said in the graduation speech, there are really two aspects. One is that follow your heart, which is routinely said, but also check and see what you do extremely well. And you are blessed if both happen to dovetail. If they don't, think it over, but never look back after you made a decision. So thank you, Bright, for being with us today, and thank you for tuning in. And remember, do something sweet for someone today. Hold a door, write a thank you, give somebody a smile, a pat on the back, and remember, we're trying to build an entrepreneurial, strong, compassionate America. Please do your part, and please tune in next time. Thank you. Thank you, Bright.
Thank you.
To share your comments and suggestions, contact Junia. The email address is juniadone@aol.com, or write to Post Office Box 169, Midland, Michigan 48640.